Hello, everybody. How is everybody today? Good. So every week, like I always kind of tell how I come up with these themes or what we're going to talk about. But it's always about like what's going on a little bit in my practice or like what I'm experiencing. And what I've noticed in the past 2 weeks is that because of my, with everything kind of going on around us, both, with the virus, are we going to be able to open back up? Are we not going to be able to open back up? The political structure, I found that I was really getting sucked into things emotionally. And it was affecting my sadhana, like it was affecting my meditation practice. I wasn't meditating. I was spending more time kind of like trying to analyze things and do research on stuff. And I mean, not bad stuff, but it was pulling me out of the practice. And I was becoming very emotional about stuff. And when I say emotional, for me, I don't really, when I came to yoga, I actually came to yoga to kind of deal with a lot of, I get angry very easily, i.e. I want to press the horn of the car when I'm not driving. Right? So I don't get sad about things. I don't get morose or depressed. I get mad. And and I think that anger is a good motivating energy. So we've already talked about anger in one of the Satsangs. So I don't have, but then I think you have to learn to temper anger, and you have to learn to channel it to actually have it be productive. So I started to find that I was automatically starting to kind of detach from things, right? Like something would come up, or somebody would give me a piece of information about some political thing, and I was just going into a detachment mode to try to even analyze it and listen to it. And I use that word detachment. And that word detachment is a much more Western terminology. Like it's a terminology that comes out of like Western therapy, right? And I wanted to go back and investigate this concept of detachment, but from the yogic point of view, and how do we and where do we start to see the word detachment enter into the yogic tradition, and at what point and why? Okay. So has everybody heard of a word called Shakshi? Shakshi. It's spelled Shakshi. And so Shakshi is what we in yoga tend to talk about when we say witness, become the witness, right? We'll say become the witness to the situation. You'll hear maybe a yoga teacher, especially at Jivamukti, talk about that. The Sanskrit term for witness is Shakshi, and Shakshi is a practice that was developed in the Vedic period, but it wasn't so much like what I'm talking about doing in the modern world, where I was saying that I was getting angry and I needed to disconnect. Shakshi was actually pure awareness. It was becoming, connecting not to the physical body, but becoming aware of the Atman, or the spirit, and then being able to observe the body. But it was a completely spiritual process. It had little or nothing to do with the external world, or the world outside of the inner world. It was all about the inner world, Shakshi. And it was considered, Shakshi is considered to be beyond time, space, and experience, right? So you can't say, well, today I had experienced the Shakshi or the witness, because the witness is beyond time. So even when I said I was getting upset because somebody was telling me this information, or I was getting information and I needed to detach from it, that would not be Shakshi, because that's in a specific time reference. So therefore that defeats that term of Shakshi, right? So when we look at like what the word Shakshi means, it means nothing will exist in the internal world but the self. And so you become the witness to the self. So that term, Shakshi, really doesn't help us in the chaos that we're experiencing right now. It's a term that's it's very meant for connecting to something very esoteric. And when we talk about, the idea of colonization and cultural appropriation, this is a good place. Whenever you start looking at a Sanskrit words are pretty specific about what they mean. They're not like a lot of English terms where they can mean different things at different times. They can be very specific, and Shakshi becomes very specific. So it becomes this pure consciousness that's of the unchanging reality. Okay. So it's not just being the witness, because witness also becomes very confusing for those of us in Western civil culture. And civil meaning like we live in society. If I say that I was the witness to a fire, a house burning down, I'm in the West, I'm kind of expected to pick up my cell phone and call 911, right? If I witness a car accident, in Western culture, I'm expected to kind of stop and actually help to see if I can get help and have people rescued, whether it's dialing 911, dialing an ambulance, just seeing if people are okay. But, we really view people who, in Western culture, who stand on the roadside and just kind of witness an accident or tragedy as kind of like almost perverted voyeurs or gawkers, right? We really frown upon it. So witness is also a term that's kind of difficult in our society, because a witness is expected to be involved at a certain level and actually be able to convey what they've seen and actually be of help or use. And that's how we interpret that word witness within Western, in American culture. Even when we say a witness to a crime, a prosecutor finds a witness who is unwilling to testify of no use, of no value, right? So witness in the West needs to be of value. So I went to that word detachment, right? I used that word detachment to kind of announce what we were talking about. But then as I looked in the Sanskrit dictionary, looking for what is the word for detachment and how is detachment used in Sanskrit, Shakshi was not available. What was available was dala, which means fragmentation. So in Sanskrit, D-A-L-A, dala, which, and if I'm pronouncing something wrong, anybody can correct me. My Sanskrit is not the best. Vayagga, Vayaska, Vayasagya. I'm going to spell it instead of pronouncing it. D-Y-A-S-A-G-G-A. Rupa, you want to write that down and correct my pronunciation? V-Y-A-S-A-G-G-A.
This is not ringing a bell at all. Yeah. So D-Y-A is. Yeah.
B-Y.
B.
D as in Victor.
Oh, hang on. Is it not? It's not Vairagya though.
V-Y-A-S-A-G-G-A.
Vyasagya.
Say it again.
Vyasagya.
Vyasagya. So that means a detachment or a cutting off. And then the other term that came up with the word detachment is kavalya, which is very specific because that is a detachment of the soul from the material world, which is the same as the Jivamukta, right? Kavalya and Jivamukta are similar terms. So in reality, detachment isn't really used in this early Vedic world, or this where yoga kind of gets its roots. We don't actually see the term detachment applied until we get into the Buddhist tradition. And the Buddhist tradition came up with a term called Shakshibhava, like bhavantu, right? We've heard that word bhav. And in Buddhist translation, that means an attitude of witness to the existing world with detachment. So that is where the first time that we actually see the idea that I am actually not only engaging with the internal world, but I'm actually engaging with the external world. And I'm using the same concept of Shakshi to interact with the external world or observe it or watch it so that I can control the emotions, the thoughts, and the actions of myself. But I'm not ignoring the world, but I'm detached from it. And I do want to make one clarification, because that would come into, because bhava actually means a state of being. Like Sharon sometimes attributes it to a divine mood, but actually it would be a state of being. So the witness of the state of being is what Shakshi Bhava would be. And I wanted to talk about like how that is kind of working for people right now. And in your practice, how many of you are applying this idea of needing to detach from some of the situations that are happening, and also realizing that detachment from some of these situations is actually a healthy thing for us. That sometimes we feel guilty, especially in times of crisis, where we start to detach a little bit to be the witness, to observe what's going on. And then, because that was what happened to me immediately, is I felt guilty that I was needing to do that. But then I realized, no, I have to do this because it's healthy for me to do this. because it's unhealthy for me to just stomp around the house angry all the time. So I want to, Tara, talk to me about, because sadhana is really like, and you guys in Kundalini, you guys use that word sadhana more than we do in Hatha Yoga. I'm going to start using it more because I think it's important. But how has this time affected your sadhana, and what are the tools that you've been able to employ to kind of pull yourself back to make sure you stay involved with your sadhana and your practice?
With my sadhana, I'm lucky because I've had a bit strong sadhana to begin with. And I've been in some crazy situations, and I just came home after being away for 2 months, and my sister was, plugged into CNN, Fox, every single news station 24/7, right? All the corporate news. And I found it was the only way for me to sort of come back to center was to do like sadhana is not an option. It's not an option. It's mandatory during these times. It's
Right.
not, you're right. Cause I would get crazy too. And I would get judgmental and frustrated and angry, and that we're listening to news 24/7 because it's such a non-reality. Like that corporate news, what you're watching on TV has nothing to do with reality, nothing. So it's like, how do you separate from that? So I've been doing a lot of breath work. I've been doing a lot of meditation. I would like to get back into doing more physical Jivamukti. I've been doing what we call Sarabandhas, which is like, downward facing dog to, plank and then back up and to get strong. But I'm also in a position where I coach a lot of people. So like, if I'm not in my center, like it's tough. And there are days I just lose it. There are days that I just lose it. And I'm like, okay, let's get back to my sadhana has been my only saving grace. It's my daily practice. It's my daily bread.
So when you talked about like your sister, like having the news channels on and everything, is there, in your tradition, is there any validation for this concept of Shakshi Bhava, where you're actually able to observe it?
Mm-hmm. I was able just to watch it, and I was just noticing like these hypnotic loops that just keep going on and on and on, and they just keep talking over it to suck you in, right? And to create more fear. And I was just noticing it. I'm just like, it's interesting, right? But my mind gets like, I have a very active negative mind, right? So it's like, I can get very judgmental about the whole thing. And, that's not helpful either, right? Like just, about what's going on. And, but yeah, it's just, I've spent a lot of time just on my mat, on my, doing my yoga because it's all I know to do. It's all that I know to do.
Right.
Yeah. And the days that I don't do it, I really suffer. Like it's almost unbearable. I'm also going through like a separation and like all this kind of stuff is happening. And it's like, it's too much. It's too much. Yeah. So it's actually driven me closer to my own sovereignty, back into my own being and to what's important to me. It's like this divine connection.
Yes. Yeah. I think that like one of the things that's really difficult about that idea of disconnecting or is that it doesn't mean that you don't care.
Right.
It actually means that you really do care. I know that when I went through a lot of, when I was going to therapy, my therapist kept telling me that I was an enabling personality and that I had to learn to detach, that I had to quit getting involved in trying to rescue everybody.
Yeah,
so that was
similar.
Yeah. And so that was a big, for me, that was actually a lead into the yoga practice. Mm-hmm. Like it was this idea of, well, how do I detach? And she was like, well, I think you should go to meditation. And I think you should go to a yoga class, And so that was specifically the reason why my therapist was guiding me to yoga and meditation was to learn to detach and quit getting wrapped up with trying to fix everybody's life around me. And I never was able to fix it. Let me be clear. I wasn't very good at it. I wasn't Dolly Levite. So I wasn't able to make anything better. And in fact, a lot of times I was actually being set up to come in to try to make things better, only to be blamed for why it was worse. So that would happen quite often. That it was, you were actually being played by people.
Yeah, I see that. I was, I've been in that sort of position the last few months where everything's my fault and people are, because they're angry, right? And it's like, in order for me to like be able to feel their angriness or whatever it is, it's just like, I've got to stay strong in myself. And it's creating boundaries. I've been working a lot on boundaries, but not like boundaries like, oh, I want you out. It's boundaries for me, like, and my boundaries are what's important to me. How do I stay in my own sovereign being and how do I stay connected? I mean, they're really for myself and like not sacrificing that.
Right. And I love that word boundaries. Like for some reason, we in the West assume that yogis have no boundaries. Like, and it happens on every level. Once you have our yogi, yoga's for free. Why do you want to ask me for money? What do you mean I can't do what I want? What do you mean I can't do this? I mean, so yoga somehow, as in the West, has been interpreted as people that don't have boundaries or don't have limitations. And that is, in fact, that is so anti the concept of yoga, because in reality, yoga's on every level is helping you to understand boundaries. Physically, yoga is helping you understand boundaries, right? The boundaries of going into an asana so that it's helpful and healthy and energetically right, or when it becomes unhealthy. The boundaries of actual, like, being with yourself, knowing the boundaries of the mind, of the thoughts and the emotions, setting boundaries for you internally, and then also setting boundaries and having a certain what's the word I'm looking for? A certain standard that you're going to live your life by.
Right.
That is, so the whole thing with yoga is about boundaries. It's not about limitlessness in terms of, because that would just make no sense. That would actually make no sense.
Yeah, and in fact, it's hard to expand and even fathom the idea of a limitless without a boundary, right? Like, it's like you have to have a container to kind of keep yourself so you can expand.
Right. There has to, the external world has to have a container so the internal world can expand. Yeah. And that really is what yoga is teaching you, that the external world has boundaries so that the internal world can find expansiveness.
Yeah. We say in our tradition that it's like, the Yogi version said that, stress or anxiety occurs when the internal strength isn't strong enough to meet the demands of the external world. And that will cause immediate anxiety. So it's like the only thing to do is to get stronger, because none of this stuff is going away. Right? And people are going to continue to freak out and, be loopy and crazy. And it's like the only thing we can do is get stronger internally. Otherwise, we're going to become a victim of it. I mean, I've felt myself a few times, like, I'm going to go loopy if I don't my practice. So.
Yeah. Nalal, do you have anything you want to add about, like, the idea of becoming the witness with detachment? Like, is that something that you're finding that you need right now in this time where there's so many kind of chaotic energies going on around? No. There you go.
Oh, was it me?
Yes, you.
Sorry. Yeah, that's actually what I do in this situation is like pulling myself away from the madness is one of my solution, but also feeling guilty not doing anything about it.
Right.
So I think there's a way to find like what is your limit, what can you do. You can't save the whole world,
Right.
then you lose yourself. So whatever you can, I think that's the key. And meditation helps me to stay in current. What I can control, and my emotions. And we can also make things bigger in our mind. And like thinking that everything is gonna change. That's what I practice. And then just don't ignore your pain, the Buddhist thinking. Like you can't ignore the pain, you can't ignore the so we all have this attachment to the good things, right? And we're just, everything went opposite, like upside down, and everybody got freaked out. I freaked out, and then I found myself just going away somewhere else, but there's no way to where to go. So I think to observe and analyze your self-witness, and that's the big key. And then you control your emotions with yoga, meditation, with the breath work. And but how can you do, like you say, if there's a fire, you have to act on it, and
Right.
you need to just run or find a solution.
Right.
And I think it takes a lot of practice to find the balance between two. How much you want to be in the state of pleasure, and how much you want to be in the current with the, how can, like, the strength is important.
Right.
I think all these practices are helping us for yogis. We have the inner strength.
Right. So I think that, like, here again, we start to kind of put in something that, Tammy said, and now that you're saying, which is, we went back to the idea of being the witness, but at the same time, you, if you see a fire, you have to kind of, you're expected to call up 911 and be involved at a certain level. And then Tammy mentioning boundaries. So this is a very interesting idea, because if I'm the witness of a tragic situation, I am expected to call 911 and get the fire department there. However, the fire department would even tell me that I would be very foolish to run into the fire trying to save someone. The fire chief would not really be happy with me, because I'm not trained to deal with that. So therefore, that becomes the boundary. There's the boundary. There's the healthy boundary right there, that I'm doing. I have assisted in how I can, but now I have to become the witness and pull back and detach, because I'm actually not prepared to help in any kind of significant way, unless it's just calling the cat from the door into the sidewalk saying, kitty, come here. But outside of that, I can't really help. So I like what you're saying and Tammy's saying, and adding those things together so that we start making sense of this word of witness and detachment. And it's very easy to talk about it when we talk about a situation like a building on fire. But it's more complicated when we start talking about social and political issues. And Sally because you are very politically and socially active with a lot of different, things that create a lot of passion. How is any of this, do you ever find that you have to kind of start to detach and pull away and become the witness to many of the issues that you are involved with on a spiritually activist level?
I've never been less active in my life. I have not been going to things that everyone else is going to. I can't figure out a way to make that feel okay to go. I don't feel good about that. But I mean, I have been teaching a lot this summer, and I really try to focus on that as a way to do it, but it's very troubling, right? Not to be able to figure out a good way to be out in the world right now, which I have not managed to do.
Yeah.
So.
Yes. Tara, you are waving, wanting to say.
Yeah. Let's see, am I muted? Yeah, it's interesting because I also have not been called to go out to do, a lot of the demonstrations, the marches, but I am. So what my practice has given me a lot of power to sort of work within my own family unit, right? And to have these conversations and to deconstruct the racism, the negativity. I mean, and then I had my 70-year-old aunt going out to march for the first time in her life in California, right? I've got a transgender sister, right? That's I'm dealing with that and the hatred and the negativity and all this kind of stuff that's going on within my own family. So I think in a lot of ways, it's okay if you're not out there on the street, but if you're doing the internal work, right? And you're literally doing the internal work, not spiritually bypassing it. But
Right.
Having the tough conversations, starting where you are, starting on your own home front is huge because, anybody can go out and just wave their sign and, make a poster and post on Facebook, which is sort of irritating to me at times because there are people it's been irritating to me, and that's my own judgment. But I think it's necessary. Like you said in the beginning, the anger can fuel something into creativity. So it's very much needed. There are people needing to do it, but just make sure that you're integrating that into your life as well. Are you having the conversations that matter and following up? So, I mean, I don't think this is a time for anybody to feel guilty. And I think that's our tendency. We're going through a huge change, being gentle with yourself. And like you were saying, the 911, it's a prayer. Prayer is 911, and it's not nothing. It's not doing anything. Pray for these things. If you don't know what to do, just pray. Because I've seen so many miracles. The veils are very thin right now, and so much change can be had. So many people are experiencing miracles at the same time. So but you have to be inconsistent with yourself, and you have to be consistent with your creator. Be the generating, organizing, delivering force in this world, or destructive force, whatever that case may be, to create change. So don't feel guilty about anything. If you've been an activist and you're not being called to activate, we're always active activists doing whatever we can.
Right. Yes.
Well, I mean, I suppose we have to go with our own strengths, right? But it's kind of weird when your own strength doesn't feel like anything useful right now, right? But the one path I have been taking that felt better to me is in my anti-racist group. We've started having this conversation about the way that this kind of super hypercritical, polarizing way of talking to each other is actually a symptom of white supremacist thinking. And that's what we're kind of trying to work through, right? White supremacy is insistently binary system, right? The whole goal of white supremacy is to say there's the norm, that's us, and you are the all people, you're beyond that, and there's only that, right? And so kind of this critical way of talking, everything you say is stupid, I hate you, you should die, right? That kind of the culture that we live in right now.
But don't you feel like that's going both
really
ways?
Yeah.
Yes, it is, but
I-
that's so terrible that the left is getting just as caught up in a binary white supremacist way of talking, and that we
Yes.
should think about that and not do it.
Okay.
But in what so the way the problem is to articulate that in a way that makes people understand why it's not a good thing to do. Right? It's founded on something that the left should not believe in, and that we should reject.
Right.
And yet we don't have a way to talk about why we should reject it.
Right.
And why we're playing into a very bad system if we continue it. I mean, I've just been watching an email exchange between some people I know that's like, you call yourselves part of an intentional community and you're saying these vile things to each other in this email exchange. Like, well, how can we address that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So to me, that is, since theoretically is how I think.
Yeah. So that's like, to me, it's so funny because like what actually got me to kind of start to say, I need to detach and create this Shakshi Bhav was that I noticed that the people that I was agreeing with about their goal were becoming as mean-spirited. And they were saying things that I actually didn't agree with. That like I actually was taking issues with. And I'm going to tell you what hit me, because like, see, sometimes like there's these boundaries that are put in. My parents, I think I've mentioned this before, both my parents taught in the public school system after integration in the South, and in a school system that had been burned to the ground because of white supremacy. White supremacists came in and they marched in, they burned the high school down. It was rebuilt 4 years later. My parents were hired and they spent 15 years of their life in this very divided community trying to heal the community. And I heard somebody within this new movement, this new civil rights movement is what I'm calling it, say, let's defund the public schools. And I was like, oh, you just lost me. Because to me, that was like the moment I had to pull back, because it was like having cold water thrown in my face. And I thought, I have to listen to this and see what this person is actually saying. And he was actually saying, let's start to dismantle the public school system. And that's when I was like, are you crazy? Because you're playing into the hands of Betsy DeVos. Like, now the left has become the right, because they have the same agenda. They're just using different language of why they wanted to destroy a system that has been put into place that has been trying to get, it was not good in the beginning, but since the 1960s has been trying to even out racial inequality within the United States, which is the public school system is the place where that is playing out. Where and it's not perfect. It's not a perfect. It's not a utopia. It's not Cinderella running down to the ball. It's a mess, but it's one of the social experiments that this country has created. That is a social experiment that we're working it out. So at that point, I thought I have to pull back from my feelings about this movement, because I need to listen to what the leadership of this movement is actually saying, because it's not the same language that I remember from 1969 to 75. It's not the same language. It's a deconstructionist language, and right or wrong. I mean, when I was caught up in it, I didn't see that. Right, when I was caught up in, but it was that one thing, that one line. Let's defund the public school systems, and I thought, my parents have just spent their whole entire life trying to make sure that Christian schools didn't get public money, that private schools didn't get public money, that schools were funded fairly, that students' parents were involved in PTA, that we started to look at like what real testing needed to look like to move education forward for everyone. And now the answer is, well, it's a white supremacist environment, let's defund it. And I was just kind of like, whoa. So that was my beginning of practicing this Shakshi Bhava, which was to detach and observe the outside world, to not get involved with the outside world, but watch it, to listen to what was being said, not shutting down, not closing it off, not turning off the television, but really starting to do some research and some understanding of like what was being said within a movement. So I just didn't get caught up into the emotional wave of it, and actually support and help with decisions that I just personally, I can't on a ethical level, I can't agree with because of my childhood, how I was raised, what I went through as a child. I will never be able to agree with that. I won't be able to agree with it if it comes from Betsy DeVos. I won't be able to agree with it if it comes from leadership of the Black Lives Matters movement. I can't agree with it. This is a boundary. Narupa. You can turn your mic.
Okay. Very engaging discussion. So tactically speaking, for 7 or 8 years, I have not been, since 2006, I stopped reading the news, which is kind of ironic because I was still working in a very news-driven industry, which was finance. So I actually used to just scroll through financial headlines and look at them from a point of neutrality. And I would read the most read list on the New York Times. And I figured that looking back on it now, I think that was just my own act of self-preservation. And I still sort of don't really read the news and engage much with social media. I'm very selective and very curated in what I'm looking for sometimes. But that's because I think to what Tammy was saying and to what you were saying, my internal architecture was not strong enough. And until I could strengthen that, this ability to bear witness, the ability to create differentiated levels of awareness, I think that my tactic still is sometimes I'll just pull away. The act of being a witness, there's many shades to it, I think, and I love the way the Buddhists think about it, especially like in Vipassana and insight meditation. They always talk about allow for the thoughts to arise, allow for them to arise as cloud patterns in the sky, and observe them like they're clouds. And meaning like don't draw judgment, don't attribute judgment to it. And similarly, I think the most energy draining part of the cycle of this, I think, is honestly when my ego jumps in and says, it immediately starts to want to make attachments to what's happening. Right? And what does this mean for me, or what am I doing? So this kind of inflated sense of having to take responsibility, this inflated sense of guilt. But instead, if I could just step back and just observe without judgment, and just observe and not allow for the story making to kick in. That takes a lot of training and that takes a lot of discipline, but I will say that I am much more now in a position to at least know when I'm spiraling. And a lot of the spiraling obviously is happening for me from the story making. Yeah. And whether it's my story or someone else's story, in that sense, I think we are all connected. You know what I mean? We're storytelling creatures. Boundaries, I'm from a culture that has no boundaries, you know? I mean, so this part I've always struggled with. I've always kind of violated boundaries, and I've just, and so part of this lesson has also, the last like 2 years or 3 years has also been about learning to establish healthy boundaries. in relationships, in your relationship with time, how you, like with work, I burned out because I didn't have boundaries.
Right.
I burn out relationships when I over communicate. So I am very much for setting boundaries, but it was interesting because when I was listening to, if we are in the witness state, I think boundaries is a dance. It's like a very fluid thing. It doesn't become as much, the syntax is not as much us versus them. I think that it just becomes like what is happening at that moment. You know what I mean? And it's a very heightened state to be in. I'm probably there like 0.0001% of the time, but the few times I have actually had a chance to witness that, which actually honestly has come to me during yoga practice and or like when I'm writing, or the very rare chance that I'm actually listening. Listening is also so hard, you know, and it's magnificent. And I think that to cultivate that sensibility of that center, that architecture that is firm but also moves and is flexible and adapts, right? I think that that's definitely the holy grail for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's very interesting too. And then like, it's interesting that you say you're from a culture that has no boundaries. Like,
I mean, they will with the same note ask me how much I make a year, to like when I'm getting married, to why I didn't have kids, to why have I become fat, to, you know what I mean? That's what I mean by no boundaries, right? And there's something also very endearing about that part of about Indian culture in other ways.
Do you think that's also because maybe there's so many people there and such a, like it's population wise?
Well, we don't have the luxury of space. That's one.
There's not a luxury of space.
There's no luxury of space, but it's also, I think there's a certain inherent social structure there where you are not you. Your identity is so enmeshed with the communal identity, the family identity.
Right.
Individuation is just very different in India. You know,
Right.
It's such a Western concept sometimes if you think about it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of my little 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the. I mean, this is also a very interesting topic, individuality and how that it's Western psyche really has a hard time with the yogic tradition of the loss of identity to actually find yoga. That it's almost as if it's so in conflict that we really in the West don't really talk about how it's there in the teachings, the communal or the group or the experience as the whole instead of the individual. And we celebrate the individual so much in European white culture.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that there's also, like when Sally uses the word white supremacy, that's something that's not really investigated in terms of white supremacy. Like, what is it that allows white supremacy to rise within European culture is the idea of individuality. It's that alone that is the bed, you know, the fertile soil for the seed of white supremacy to blossom. Because it's that idea that Western culture has always looked down upon the Eastern mind of this communal group oneness concept. They think it's weak. They see it as a weakness. There's no more the hero, like, because in Eastern mythology there is no hero.
Mm-hmm.
There is no hero. And Western mythology, whether it's Greek, Roman, you know, Nordic, you know, there's Beowulf, there's always the individual hero.
Yeah.
And that I believe is something that should be looked at. and talked about, and how that it's almost, and when we talk about the right and the left sounding like each other, it's actually the fact that that idea of individuality and uniqueness comes out no matter if you're from American culture, if you're from this culture. It's so ingrained, no matter what race you are, no matter what gender you are, no matter what this idea of the individual. I don't have to wear a mask. You're taking away my personality, my freedom, my identity. That's why people get upset about that mask. It takes away their identity. You know, it's very interesting. It's very interesting. You have to go? Okay.
I'm sorry, you guys.
That's okay. Thank you for being here. Sam, do you have anything you'd like to add to this too?
Sure. I actually was, I have therapy the hour before this, so we talked about this, this notion too. It's very funny. I have a very Western, central time before this, and then I come here and get this. So I kind of get both worlds on this, and it's interesting. We talked about this notion of specifically identity and attachment to it. And I have these kind of two major identity labels that I attribute to myself. And something that I was thinking about with what Tammy said about creating the vessel. Like, we create the vessel in the external world so that the internal world can expand. We both talked about that. And I was trying to think about how that applied to my therapy session today. Because one thing that I talked about was this thing that I do. I fixate on one part of me to the exclusion of everything else. And I hyper fixate on it. So, like, for example, if I want to be the best yoga teacher in the world, I think, oh, I'm only going to do that. I'm only going to practice yoga. I'm only going to think about it. And I reach a saturation point and I collapse. And I do this all the time. This has been a pattern of mine for years, where I get so invested in one thing because I'm trying to perfect it. And then when I inevitably fail at doing that thing in that moment, I then want to shift gears. And when I shift gears, I carry that fear of failure with me. So then I do the opposite. I don't invest enough. So there's this constant back and forth of, like, what am I? Who am I? And how am I? What is my level of success within those identities? Whereas, if the conclusion that I reached today, which was kind of impressive for me, was this notion of if I set boundaries on how long I spend doing any one thing. I have a lot of passions. If I set boundaries on how long I do any one thing, I create room for success in each part of me. And then I start to learn that I'm not any one of those things, but I'm all of them. So even within the vessel that I have, I create compartments, one for dance, one for yoga, one for cooking, one for sewing, just any of the things that I love to do. And so when I have those smaller moments to spend in each thing, I have more success. And success doesn't necessarily mean that I've reached a completion point, but I've gone further in the process of figuring out who and what I am as a whole. And the reason that that's important for me is just because of how my brain works. Like, even yesterday, I was working on the script for week 2 basics, because I'm teaching that tomorrow. And when I initially started writing the script for it months ago, I was so invested in doing the whole thing and, like, getting it all done in one go, and I was frustrating myself. And the thing that's been successful over the last 2 weeks writing it has been write one section of it, take a break. And that's what I did all yesterday. I spent hours working on it, but I would take a break and walk away from it, play with my cat, feed myself, do something else completely unrelated, have a phone conversation with a friend, and I finished it.
All right.
So when I set these boundaries for myself, I then don't have to attach this notion of success as a yoga teacher of perfecting it right now in the moment as a whole. I can do it in parts and pieces.
Right. So detaching from it actually allows you to complete it.
Yes.
Or to finish it. So that's very interesting too, that idea of detachment can actually get your focus back. Have you kind of, which is, it goes back to that idea of darshan, like when we talked about darshan, that actually darshan is this also the shakshi bhav. It's observing externally without getting involved in it. It's very interesting. Yeah. Sybil, how about you? Do you have anything you want to add?
I don't know. I had a lot of feelings going on. I guess when I was younger, I was very detached, so I didn't really feel anything or really react very strongly to things. Then I guess I got into IT, and then as I progressed along up the ladder, and my main goal was to keep the systems going. So
Right.
it was always a constant stress. System would go down, you have to react. Everything was, so I was so always attached. And I would always do my best to get the system back up and running. And then once I retired, like I said, phew, I was able to then go back into kind of like a detached mode. So I didn't let anything stress me out anymore. So I've been kind of in that mode right now, lately, or more, I said less, I guess, since I retired. So I don't even listen to the news, honestly. I don't want to know. I mean, I know what's kind of going on, but not to the detail level. Like, I don't obsess over it.
Right.
So that's why I don't get stressed out. So I've just, I guess, learned to do that just for my sake.
Right.
Being in such a stressful job that I've had to wind down and just set myself, within my own sanity, to kind of like block all that out. So.
Yeah. And I think some people, like there are some personalities that they are easier to detach than others. Like for whatever reason, I think Bobby's a bit more like that. He can be a little detached kind of naturally, right, Bobby? Do you have to disagree with me or agree with me on that?
Well, I coming from a family where no one was allowed to really say or feel anything, I think there's a couple different detachment. I think there's maybe 3 levels. One is shutting down totally, like the 3 monkeys. You hear no evil, see no evil, do no evil, but you block everything out. One is ignoring someone or something, and that is, you can hear, you can see, you can't feel though, I think. And then the real yogic detachment is something where you observe, you see, you hear, and you feel compassion, but you don't act.
I would actually think, I actually believe that to ignore, you don't hear, you don't see, you don't feel. You're ignoring it. And that's the negative side of detachment to an extreme, which is kind of good that we're ending on that, because that is a lot of times what people think detaching is to ignore it. And it's not ignoring it, because ignoring it is very destructive. Ignoring something is actually a divisive form of detachment. But because, like what you said, detachment is hearing, seeing, and actually having empathy for it.
Yeah.
But you're not going to jump in and stomp on it or pick it up and run and try to score a touchdown. you're going to sit back and you're going to be the witness to it. You're going to watch it. You're going to acknowledge it, but not get deeply involved in it at the moment. It doesn't mean that like going forward you won't, but it does mean at the moment you're not.
Yeah. And sometimes, I mean, in order not to overreact and be emotional, you just have to pull back and then digest all of it and then make a decision how to react.
Right. Well, I think that that's a good place to kind of finish this up, kind of, because you kind of brought it back to that idea of ignoring. What's the difference of ignoring? I think that as time things go on and go forward, a practice of observing the external with detachment is probably going to be really useful, because as things kind of open up and we get back to being with people, people have been away from each other for 4 months, and people are going to be highly charged when they get into